It's an extremely popular and yet controversial narrative that is consistently brought up in today's NBA discussions. The game has gone soft. You'll hear the old heads say it, both athletes and fans, talking about how their generation was tougher and things didn't come as easily back in their day. Is there some bias to their opinions? Sure, of course there is. But if you ask me my opinion, the NBA has gone soft. But it might not be for the reasons you think, or the reasons the old heads say. A lot of people like to point to today's players, and act like it's all because of their sensitive and fragile personalities, and although that might be true in a few cases, I think it's far from the main reason the game has become soft. There have been multiple significant events that have taken place throughout the years that have led our game to be the soft NBA that it currently is. In this one, we're taking a look at how the game has evolved throughout the years and just try to understand just exactly what is behind this narrative that claims that today's game is soft. This tends to be a touchy subject among fans because of the nostalgia of the older crowd and the recency bias of the younger fans. Everyone wants to say that their generation of basketball is the best brand of basketball, so please, let's enter this with an open mind. Agreed? Let's dig in. The physical and punishing days of basketball go as far back as its very beginning. The game of basketball was invented in December 1891 by James Naismith, a teacher and sports coach out of the University of Kansas. The game of basketball would ultimately become one that would reward finesse, but in those early years, the athletes were still making their adjustment from physical sports like football and rugby. The game was quite exciting and violent in the beginning. Steel mesh cages had to be constructed around the courts in order to keep excited spectators and fans from interfering with play, which also led to basketball players getting nicknamed cagers. Players would often slam each other into the steel wire, and the court was frequently covered in blood. One of the early players said, "The center tap was murderous. I've seen guys crippled." So the next time someone tries to brag to you about how the 80s or 90s were the most physical era, you might want to tell them about the 1890s, when basketball was played in a bloody cage. It wasn't until the early 1900s that the steel cage was replaced with a rope mesh net, and thus the game had begun to go soft. Okay, I'm obviously kidding. That change was absolutely necessary for obvious reasons. Let's fast forward a bit. Throughout the years of the NBA's history, the game has been dominated by big men, from George Mikan in the 40s and 50s, to Russell and Chamberlain in the 60s, to Kareem, to Shaq. The big man has been a force in the league for decades and has been able to use his size and strength to impose his will, both offensively and defensively. Underneath the basket is where most of the physicality happens and where the big man makes his money. With that being said, the NBA has been slowly reducing that interior advantage for years. Thanks to George Mikan's dominance in the early 1950s, the lane under the basket was widened from 6 feet to 12 feet, and as we know, an offensive player cannot be in this lane for 3 seconds. 1 decade later, and the lane was widened again from 12 feet to 16 feet, thanks to Wilt Chamberlain's dominance. This restricts the dominant big man from being able to simply camp under the basket, which naturally forces the big man to the perimeter. A more perimeter style of basketball means a less physical game, and with a less physical game comes a softer game. Into the 70s now, the dark ages of the NBA in many ways. Drug problems were rampant in the league at this time, and so was fighting. And with that came the negative perception of the league with racist conclusions, and the popularity of the game was reaching a concerning low. The NBA had to make changes, including more specific rules of conduct between players and harsher penalties for players who engaged in fighting. Thus another move which created a softer form of basketball. Now I should clarify, not all changes the league has made to make the game softer have been negative ones in my mind. Of course the league shouldn't allow an extensive amount of fighting and violence. In fact, that's something I would like you to consider as we progress through the rest of this video. Which of these changes were absolutely necessary, and which ones would we have been better off without? Jump ahead into the 80s and we have the arrival of the saviors of the NBA, Magic Johnson and Larry Bird. With them leading the way, the 80s were an extremely competitive and physical era of basketball. Although there wasn't fights seemingly every night like there was in the 70s, the style of play was still very physical and punishing. One team embodied this physical and brutal style of play more than any other, the bad boy Detroit Pistons. Their style of play was notorious and went even further beyond the physicality norm of that era. This team was considered extremely dirty and did not have the respect of many of their peers. The greatest rival to the Pistons during those years were Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls. The Bulls and the Pistons met in the playoffs 4 straight years from 1988 to 1991. The Pistons had a famous defensive scheme created by Isaiah Thomas to contain Michael Jordan, famously known as the Jordan Rules. The rules were essentially to make Jordan work vigorously on both sides of the ball, and anytime he drove the lane, they put him on his back. Michael took a beating those years in Detroit. Whether it was a hard foul or a soft foul, it didn't matter. It was all treated as the same common foul during that era of basketball. The NBA felt a need to make a change to protect its players, so they created the flagrant foul rule and began implementing it in the 1990-91 season. The flagrant foul essentially meant that any excessively violent or inappropriate contact that you committed would result in free throws and possession of the ball for the opponent, and even potentially an ejection, as compared to before when it required 2 technical fouls for an ejection. Before the flagrant foul had been implemented, there was basically an unwritten no layups rule. It made sense to punish the offensive player who was driving the lane and make him earn his free throws. But now, with the flagrant foul, a punishing foul could result in 4 or 5 points for the opponent in just one possession and the loss of your rim protector to an ejection. The same punishing, physical style of play that was common in the 80s now didn't work as a strategy for winning basketball, and of course, the game became softer as a result. Now on to the 2000s, where the NBA made several changes to the way the game is played. One of those changes was the hand check rule. The hand check rule was originally introduced in 1994, but the rules were updated and made even more strict in 2004. In the past, defensive players were able to place their hands on the offensive player and basically steer the player in which direction he wanted the offensive player to go. But the NBA completely eliminated the defender's ability to hand check the offensive player. Of course, this creates a less physical style of play. It also creates more freedom of movement for the offense, which is the primary reason I believe the NBA made this change. Because offense is sexy. It makes plenty of highlights. Star players making plays is sexy, like slam dunks, crossover dribbles, 3-pointers, and so on. The defense controlling the offensive player is not sexy. Physical style of play is also not sexy. It's ugly, and even if it works, it doesn't entertain the casual fan. Now imagine having to defend a player as fast and explosive as Russell Westbrook, who's dribbling at the top of the key. In generations past, you would be able to place your hands on him and give him a forearm to ensure he doesn't blow by you on his way to the rim. But once the hand check rule was put in place, you couldn't do that anymore. Now you had to rely solely on your ability to slide your feet quickly in order to keep your body in front of him. But with your back to the basket and the league full of guards with crazy speed like Russell Westbrook and John Wall, how can we possibly expect the defender to be able to stay in front of him? Not only did this allow wing players to get to the rim more easily, but as we talked about earlier, there was now less the rim protector could do to stop the offensive player once he actually got to the rim, because physical defense is being punished more harshly now. This was just another step in which the league may have created a more entertaining product, but also a softer one. Another NBA-altering event took place around that same time, November 19th, 2004, arguably the most terrible day in NBA history, known as the Malice at the Palace. The matchup was between 2 title contenders and Eastern Conference rivals, the Pistons and Pacers. These two teams had a history of hard-fought battles and moments of chippiness. In fact, the game itself had plenty of physical, intense moments between the players, which had part in leading up to its climactic ending. There was less than a minute remaining in the fourth quarter. The game had been clearly decided with the Pacers holding a 15-point lead when Ron Artest fouled Ben Wallace from behind. Wallace took offense to the hard foul and retaliated at Artest, shoving him back. Players and coaches quickly surrounded the two players, trying to defuse the situation. Ron Artest then decided for some reason he wanted to chill on the scorer's table while the rest of the players and coaches sorted it out. After laying there for several moments, Artest was then hit directly by a cup of beer from a fan several rows up. In a rage, Artest ran up into the stands to punish the fan who threw the cup. Several players followed Ron into the stands, and what ensued was an absolute brawl between players and fans. Steven Jackson was throwing punches, and fans were throwing punches. Players and coaches were trying to restrain each other. Jermaine O'Neal got involved and threw a running punch at a confrontational Pistons fan. Angry fans were throwing popcorn and drinks at the players as they entered the tunnels, and children were crying in the audience. The game had to be cut short because of the violence on display. It was a sad and disturbing sight, one like the NBA had never seen before. The following day, the league took strong action, handing out strong suspensions to the players. This game didn't just have an effect on the players' seasons and the Pistons and Pacers season, but it had an effect on the future of the NBA as a whole. You see, the NBA suffered a gigantic hit to their reputation due to this game, and the league was determined to repair their reputation to ensure nothing like this ever happened again. Remember, this entire fiasco started with some chippiness, some pushing, and trash talking between the players. So after the Malice at the Palace, the refs became even quicker to call technical fouls to defuse situations. Back in the day, players could have ongoing trash talking and you could sense the tension. But now, a player simply looks at another player wrong and the ref is quick to tee him up. You just don't see the same disdain and intensity between players anymore, but that's in large part because the referees won't let it even come close to escalating to that anymore. It may have been a necessary priority for the league to make, but in doing so, it also softened the game tremendously. That is some of the NBA's history that has brought us to the league we know today. I see a lot of players taking heat for being soft, but when you honestly look at the game's history and what brought us here, you'll see that it was mostly the league itself that made the game soft and not its players. Players today can't even play a hard style of basketball even if they wanted to. They simply aren't allowed to. But here's the question, can you honestly blame the NBA for taking this approach? I mean, who really wants to see the Celtics season ruined next year to another Kyrie Irving injury because the defending team was punishing players who drove the lane like the 80s Pistons did? Who really wants to see another escalated fight like the Malice at the Palace, where players and fans are literally fighting, leaving children in the stands crying, who came to the game just to see their heroes play basketball? I certainly don't want to see that again. The league has made many significant changes throughout the years, but honestly, I understand those changes. I loved the NBA back in the day, and sometimes I reminisce about its old school style, but I also love today's NBA. I appreciate today's game for all the things that it is, but I also appreciate it for all the things that it isn't.